Apparently there's a recording in progress. All right, welcome guys. Last week we spent some time going through mainly John Wesley's biography, and we got a little bit of Whitefield in that process. Remember the interaction between the Wesleys and Whitefield and the early Methodist movement and how they got at odds a little bit over Calvinism versus Arminianism. And then we got to this point, which is where we stopped last week, and talked about this idea that is referred to as Christian perfection, which is not what you think it is, which is one of the things that we talked about today. So that's what we're going to pick back up, which is this idea that Wesley had. Goes by a number of different names. Christian perfection is the term that he would have used for it, but he also explains sort of what that is, even in writing. It's not perfection in the sense of Christ was perfect, so don't think that that's what it is. But this idea of the technical term that theologians would use for this is the sanctification process. We're justified in our salvation, but then what is the process of sanctification? So we're going to again pick back up with Dr. Reeves here talking about this, Wesley's view on salvation. This is mainly going to focus on his idea though about how sanctification works. He's going to continually make the point here that Wesley and Luther probably would have come to some odds over this, in the sense that, remember, Luther coming along with the salvation through faith alone is so emphatic, I mean, very emphatic about salvation is not through works, that once you started talking about works, Luther would get kind of nervous about that, because he was concerned that what would creep back in his day would be this idea of a works-based salvation. Given the history that we've gone through, you can see where he would have that concern. Now, remember, we are 1517 to the early 1700s. We're 200 years removed from Luther. It seems like there's such a short period of time, but it's 200 years removed from Luther. And so there's been that space. And so things have evolved and other things have come along. Other things came along in the process. But Reeves is going to make the point repeatedly about the fact that this would have been the point of tension. If Luther and Wesley had been contemporaries, this is where they would have clashed, because Luther was very much protective of this idea. There's nothing that we do that earns salvation. And Wesley is not suggesting that. He's just talking about what does that mean or become. And so that's where this tension exists that he's going to talk about here. And then we'll slide after that into, there's several excellent videos here. It's tough for me to leave anything out, so I'm not gonna, basically. Is one on the First Great Awakening, which is where we'll slip into, which ties in with this and the role of particularly Whitefield in the preaching in America on that, but others as well. We didn't watch an excellent video that he has. I recommend it if you want to go back and pick it up on Jonathan Edwards, which is a whole other thing. Yeah. If most people know Jonathan Edwards, if by no other ring, his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, right? Right. And he gives some background on that. That's worth a watch. We're not going to watch it together, so I recommend that. There's actually a subsequent video after the First Great Awakening, which is on the American Revolution in the church. I'm going to summarize that. It's good stuff, but it runs long for what it is, because then we need to come back in, and we don't need to miss the Second Great Awakening, which is after that, because there's some important elements of the Second Great Awakening that pick up on the first one, but are also separate, because they are, just to give you the idea of the timeline here, the First Great Awakening is in the early 18th century, pre-American Revolution. The American Revolution comes along. The Second Great Awakening is basically right after the American Revolution for a period of about 30 to 40 years. So the big flow of history there is, in terms of that, is First Great Awakening, things that go on around the American Revolution, Second Great Awakening, they all do sort of meld together there. I mean, it's not like there's clear breaks. I mean, it's a flow, but the Second Great Awakening is distinct from the first, and one of the separating events is the revolution that's in the middle of that. So we will spend some time talking about the Second Great Awakening, because it happens while there's the westward expansion of the United States, and so that influences theologically what the country is becoming because of that westward expansion, and who's doing that expansion and what's expanding. Because what is not expanding are the more traditional Protestant denominations of the Northeast. Most of the expansion is actually happening by those, spoiler alert, that are more of a Methodist and Baptist persuasion. So that's what flows across the country, is more Methodism and Baptist theological thought than Puritan thought, because the Puritan thought remains sort of in the Northeast and along the seaboard, just because of the way that westward expansion and, you know, the 19th century concept of manifest destiny and how all of that, you know, we buy this big chunk of land from France and all the stuff that goes with that. So that's sort of the general flow over the next couple of weeks. We're going to watch this video. We may get into the First Great Awakening video, but really the stuff to talk about is here. So we probably will camp out here after we watch this video. Any questions about that? All right. And the way so much easier when I'm not turning my back to this one. It's actually above me.
Yeah,
I've got it in
so
the
you can
orientation.
see it.
Yeah, so this is going to work better.
What did Wesley actually teach about the subject of free will, grace, and Christian holiness? Well, we need to go back to the comments that we were making in our last lecture about Wesley's life. We said there that John Wesley's commitment to the idea of Christian holiness or to sanctification have at times caused people to doubt whether or not Wesley is fully Protestant, maybe. They certainly doubt that he is Lutheran. Well, we want to consider that. The fact of the matter is that Wesley does have a number of differences with the earliest Protestants in terms of their tendency, in particular Luther's tendency, to separate justification from sanctification very aggressively. Now, of course, in that context, in the 16th century, those Protestants coming out of the medieval world were very allergic to the subject of combining a conversation about good works with the topic of justification. Luther in particular stressed a pretty radical distinction between works of the law, following the law on the one hand, and the subject of justification and the work of Christ on the other. Well, when we look at Wesley's theology, we need to acknowledge that he does affirm in no uncertain terms this essential understanding of justification. Wesley actually has a book entitled Justification by Faith. In it, he affirms all of the same doctrines by name that Luther and the Protestants do. He comments on how it's the work of Christ, not the work of our sanctification, that matters. He talks about the imputation of Christ's righteousness, which is a word that means the covering of our sin by the righteousness of Christ. So he is absolutely on that wavelength. He has not rejected by name any of the doctrines of justification by faith that were associated with the Reformation. What's different about Wesley's theology, though, is what he sees the result of justification as being. Again, to stress, Luther is allergic to discussing justification in a way that makes works or sanctification required. This is more of a pastoral point for Luther. Luther is concerned, and in his day and age, he's rightly concerned. And Lutherans would say that we should be concerned about this at any time in the church's history. But for Luther, from a pastoral standpoint, he's very concerned about the slippery way that we begin with justification, but then we slip into talk of sanctification in a way that makes it sound as if we're not justified without good works. It's one of emphasis, one of the accent that he places on justification. Now, anyone who has read Luther, of course, will find all kinds of places where he does talk about good works, but he will not discuss them in the context of justification. He really, really stresses the need, pastorally in particular, to keep these separate. To use a practical example, Luther says essentially that our wills, even after conversion, if they hear that there are obligations that require someone to be sanctified, Luther will see in this a code word or a shorthand expression of the idea that what we're communicating, even if our words don't suggest this, but what we are communicating is that justification is only the beginning of our salvation, so that we get in by Christ's work, but we stay in by our works. Now, again, Wesley's not going to say this. He's not going to go to this point. He's going to come close to it, and he's certainly going to push this boundary. So in a way, you might say that Wesley is fundamentally Protestant. He has not rejected the Protestant message, but what he has rejected is the pastoral application of Luther's, that you do not talk about sanctification or holy living in the context of the Christian life. He is not allergic to that. In fact, he thinks it is required but you talk about Christian good works and sanctification. So for Wesley, justification is the door to sanctification. It is the foundation upon which you build the life of the Christian. And the way Wesley gets at this, again, by rejecting the Reformed or even the Lutheran understanding of predestination, is he begins to talk about something that's called prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is somewhat akin to the Arminian understanding of the way in which God sort of halfway redeems or illuminates or frees all people in this world from the blindness of sin. Prevenient grace is when God.
So remember the TULIP acronym? What does the T stand for?
Total depravity.
So you're not just depraved, you are totally depraved, which means if you are totally depraved, what ability do you even have to make any choice towards God? None. And so that's in the most strict idea of a Calvinistic expression, it would be that it's total depravity, which means that's why the election concept gets brought in the way that it does, because only God can choose to even save you, because you have no ability. You are totally, completely depraved. The total depravity. That's what the T is. So what Wesley brings, and the Arminian position had already brought, was this idea that there has to be something that at least, they're not saying you're not depraved. There is the belief that we're a fallen, sinful condition. We are depraved, but there has to be something that enables you to even make the choice to accept the gift. And that's where prevenient grace comes in. Was this idea that this is a measure of grace that is actually sort of imposed upon you to some degree by God to give you the ability to be restored back to the position of being able to choose free will. In fact, notice here the way it's expressed. I think he does a really good job. It's God's grace to everyone to restore free will. This is just enough grace to be able to choose. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Do you buy that?
If you buy the total depravity, hopefully.
Yes, I think Lorinda makes an excellent point. Do you believe we're depraved?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you believe we are totally depraved?
I tend to say yes, because of scripture saying that we're dead until Christ or God does something to make us alive to the things of God.
And that's what this is. That's what prevenient grace is. It's that something that God does initially to give us the opportunity to, again, choose him. And to choose him, again, the other key word here is freely, to choose him freely. So this idea of prevenient grace, which is not exactly new with Wesley, is still there before, but he really brings it to the forefront.
I was thinking, listening to this, I was thinking of the rich young ruler. It comes to Jesus and says, "What must I do?" Jesus says, "Go and sell everything you have. Come back and follow me." And he goes away
Sad.
So with Calvin's, I don't see how you can. I don't see how you can look at that through Calvin's perspective. I mean, how did he even know to ask? It seems to fit closer with this prevenient grace that Christ is giving him the opportunity to ask, but it's still up to him, up to me, up to each one of us to respond.
I guess you have to also, I don't think scripture necessarily clearly makes the point of what his motivation for asking was. Was he really interested in Christ, or was he interested in?
Did he want an attaboy?
Yeah. Well, what was it he was actually looking for when he asked him that question?
Well, and again, Doug went straight to the end of the story, which is good, but there's the middle part of the story where Jesus says, well, keep the law and do these things. Well, oh, got that.
Yeah.
I got that
Yeah.
covered. I'm good on that. And then he's, oh, but then there's this, the one thing more.
One thing more.
God works first to give us the freedom of the will, so that when we hear the gospel, we are able in that freedom to choose God and to choose the gospel. So very much like the Arminians of the 17th century, Wesley here in the 18th century will say that we have freedom, but it's not a simple freedom that we have just because we're born. Instead, Wesley will say, God works first to give us the freedom to choose. And then when the gospel comes, we are able to choose thereafter. One way of seeing this is that up until this point, Wesley is not all that different from classic Arminianism. Where he does differ, though, is the application of the gospel with this talk of Christian perfection and holiness. One of Wesley's more enduring conceptions about the Christian life is that those who have been imputed with the works of Christ must subsequently be imparted the works of Christ by the operation of the Spirit. Now, again, this is right where Luther would react, that the imputed work of Christ should not be carried over into the discussion of imparted or the infusion of Christ's work into our hearts. Again, Luther's not concerned with good works or with sanctification itself. He's concerned with the pastoral placing of these things side by side.
Well,
Lorinda has a point to make.
no, she's confused.
Yeah.
Okay.
More explanation needed,
Okay.
please.
So he said earlier, what is imputation?
Imputation is the covering of sin.
So imputation happens in the phase that we would think of, or normally when you study soteriology, the big fancy word for studying salvation, would be the justification point. And that's where Christ's righteousness is imputed to you. You're not righteous, but he was. And so you're justified through his free gift.
It's like it's transferred onto you.
It's transferred onto you. You get it placed over you. We've all heard the various analogies. Normally they're judicial analogies that go on there. Because again, we're also, remember, right, when we talk about the various views of salvation, we're talking about a substitutionary view of salvation here, vicarious substitution, where Christ's righteousness is being imputed onto us in substitution of our own lack thereof. The imparted part that he's talking about here is what happens after you've been justified. This is that sanctification, working out your salvation part, which is the idea that there's something that, at least from Wesley's point of view, and this is carried down to most of our theological point of view today, that the Holy Spirit is doing something in you after you are saved, which is imparting Christ's righteousness into your life for you to incorporate that into your life. So it's not just the imputation, but it's the imparted part. Both are important. They are separate and distinct processes.
Okay, so the imputation is the covering, and the imparting is you taking it and doing something.
And
with
living it.
And
It's
doing
and even not just bringing it into your life, but taking it to
Someone.
others, imparting it outside of yourself. And he'll give an example. I think it's here in a second, talking about some of the things that do flow from this, because you're going to notice some denominational things that we haven't gotten to yet for denominations we haven't discussed, which talks about when is this imparting? What is that imparting? What form does it take? Generally, Baptist theology, what do we take to the idea of what happens at the moment of salvation? You're saved.
Yeah. We're filled with the Holy Spirit.
Right. I mean, those are simultaneous, synonymous events, right? We know that we have other Christian brothers and sisters of other denominations who think about that a little bit differently. Remember Wesley's story. Wesley was already an Anglican minister, but then he had that experience with the Moravians where he sort of had a rebirth
His heart was
experience.
strangely warm.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where a lot of this is being drawn from his emotional, back to that idea of Lutheran pietism that we talked about, his emotional experience, not just his working out what the theology is based upon what does that verse say, but what do I feel? What have I experienced? One of the things we often hear when people talk about, evangelism, they can't argue with your experience. They may disagree with it, they may not accept it, but they can't argue against it. Well, that's that emotionalism aspect being brought into play. So we still have that down to now. Does that help, Lorena?
Yes, thank you.
In his mind, this would confuse. Luther would say that this would result in the person not trusting in the work of Christ, but only in their own works as they see them worked out in their own Christian life. However, Wesley, this is where he goes. This is absolutely part of his theology. And there are a couple of code words that he uses, a couple of jargon or slogan form things that he repeats throughout his writings and in his sermons as the description of the Christian life. One of the most important ones is he talks about the idea of Christian perfection. Now, in all of my teaching, this idea of Wesley's understanding of Christian perfection is probably one of the most misunderstood phrases and theological concepts in really the history of, at least the history of Protestantism, if not all throughout church history. Wesley is using perhaps a bit of an unfortunate phrase here. Obviously, for a lot of people, the word perfection doesn't speak of levels or progress of any kind. To be a Christian who is perfect sounds as if what Wesley is saying is that the person is completely free of sin, unable to sin, and almost as if he is living in the eschaton on this side of heaven. And Wesley talks about this in the light of something that's called the second work of grace. And there are ongoing different ideas related to this as the holiness movements develop in the 19th and 20th centuries. Some in the modern world, for example, refer to the baptism of the Holy Spirit, a second grace, a second blessing, something like this. Well, this is very much part of Wesley's theology. In fact, in many ways, it comes directly from Wesley's theology on into the wide variety of holiness movements that exist in the modern world. What Wesley means by Christian perfection.
So I don't easily have the chart that we've used handy. I didn't set that up. But remember, if you're going down the method, remember that what flows out of the Methodist things are like the Pentecostal movement, the other things that are there. Now you see where that, how that has its ties back into Methodism, is this idea. You saw it through the baptism of the Holy Spirit, you know, being gifted with a second blessing. Very much those are theological constructs that are inside of those denominations. They flow out of Methodism and this idea of quote unquote Christian perfection.
Or this second gift of grace is not so much perfection in maybe the modern 21st century jargon, as it is, I like to use the word victory over sin. Wesley is very clear about this. This idea of Christian perfection is not sinless perfection. Rather, the perfection that is in play here, or the idea of perfection, is that the Christian can be so in step with the Spirit, so in love with the gospel and with Christ, that the narcissism within us becomes, at least for a time, done away with. And Wesley gives all kinds of little shadings of this. He'll say things like, those who are perfect are either those who have achieved a final perfection in which they have killed their own desires and are putting others first in every circumstance that they find themselves in, or it's those who are progressing towards that perfection. So you might say that Wesley has a bit of a play on words here. He's saying that there are those who are perfected and those who are not, but both are perfect. As long as one has the Spirit working within them, they have the opportunity for victory over sin. Well, let me give you a concrete example. Wesley might say, if he were approaching someone who was an alcoholic and this person has come to the faith, Wesley is not the man who's going to sit there and say, well, you're an alcoholic for life. There's really nothing we can do about it. We're just going to sit back and wait for Jesus. He's also not going to continue to say that it's okay. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep on with the alcoholism and let's see how that goes on. You're loved by Jesus just the way you are. No, Wesley's going to say that you can have victory over that. The Christian, he might say, does not have to be an alcoholic. He or she can have some victory over this. Now, repeatedly, Wesley does ground this in the activity of the Spirit. He is not talking about full Pelagianism, as if the Christian who ceases to be an alcoholic has done so by their own strength or by their own merit. You might say again that Wesley is an optimist when it comes to the work of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit will work. The Spirit is working. And even if you're progressing, even if there are all kinds of ways in your own life where that victory over sin is not being recognized, Wesley will still say you are on the path to Christian perfection. There is a teleology, there is an end point for you, not simply remaining who you are, but becoming more and more the restored image of God. And again, he is very clear on that.
So this is that idea of working out our salvation. Does that make sense? So salvation is a moment, it's an event. Salvation is a process.
But the statement about there are those who are perfect and those who aren't, but you're still perfect. It's because of Christ,
Right.
right? Because
Right.
of Christ. I agree with that in some level when you kind of think about it very superficially. But the idea of me not being like self-promoting and you know, I don't think of myself overall as a narcissist, but I think to so much extent, I still do things that are very me-centered. I don't think until I'm in heaven, I don't think that will ever go away. I mean, I don't, other than what Christ has done for me, I don't feel like calling myself this perfect. I'm not perfect except for what I've done through Christ. I mean, or what Christ has done for me, and I've accepted it.
I think of it more, I mean, kind of as progressive sanctification. It's a perfecting.
Right,
Like
it's the
the
process
longer
of,
that we abide in Christ and the longer that we're pursuing becoming more like Christ, that we're being perfected, but never to the degree of perfection like Christ was.
I don't know. The word perfect for me is a struggle because he's saying we can be perfect. And
He's saying that, but he's not. I mean, that's where
It
that's where the
says-
that's where the
it
it
sounds
means
like-
sinless perfection.
right.
yeah,
And to me, the one 2142 is where I need to get back to. But for me, the one key to that is, you know, it's actually there in the, if I can slide back to it, it's in the term. Perfection is not human perfection, but the perfection is Christian perfection. The perfection, to the extent that it exists at all, exists because of what? Because
because
of
of the work of
Christ.
Christ.
The
And-
power of the Spirit.
Right. And the Spirit working in us and through us and being there with us because of our justification, because of that salvation experience. But you can also see where, again, if Luther were here, being very concerned about work salvation, he might be arguing back to Wesley, you know, you got to be careful.
Yeah.
Because suddenly this becomes about, again, not that you've saved yourself, but that you stay saved by what you're
Right.
doing, which is also not what Wesley's saying, but he is pushing in the direction of there ought to be this expression of a change. And, you know,
Yeah.
we hold to that theologically as well. You know, it's, if there's no change, what actually happened to there, right?
Right.
So again, this really comes to the forefront much more in some of the later quote unquote holiness denominations, where it is that idea of, you know, how close can you get to this idea of perfection while you're still on this side of, you know, this side of heaven. Well, that's part of the debate, that's part of the discussion. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be, we should not strive for it, would be their argument. So but again, it carries on and goes through the whole context.
Image of God. And again, he is very clear on this. He is not talking about sinless perfection. In fact, he published a little book on this entitled A Plain Account of Christian Perfection. And he entirely abhors the idea that anyone should read what he is saying as being the teachings of Pelagius. Now, he is certainly semi-Pelagian in the historic sense. That is, he believes that there is a great deal of our choice and our effort and our activity, not only in sanctification, but also in the embrace of the gospel after prevenient grace. But he is not talking about works righteousness. Again, Wesley has published a book on justification by faith. What Wesley changes and the pastoral application that he provides that then infuses Methodism and the holiness movement and that over time becomes, frankly, one of the default positions of most evangelical denominations or churches, is this idea that there is a constant optimistic hope and belief that the Spirit is at work in us to improve our lives. And part of the real root of pastoral ministry, not only for Wesley, but for all Wesleyans ever since, is to see the improvement of society through the eradication of addiction, abuse, and all kinds of things that defile and destroy the image of God in us. You can look at just the history of Methodism and see repeatedly their attacks on slavery, their attacks on abuse and addiction, their real commitment to the equality of society. And you can see the implications of Wesley's theology here. He doesn't want anyone to sit back and say, well, I'm justified. I'm just going to sit around and wait, and I will share the gospel, but the gospel is simply about justification.
And here's also, I think, an overlap and a distinction again back with Luther. Luther being a monk, you know, a part of what was happening there when we think about that part of church history is what, well, church and society are separate. I can just be in this monastery and spend all day focusing on the thing and not interact or engage with the world, the real world. Now, Luther broke that down to a great degree. And Wesley's taking it a step further of saying not only do we interact with the world, we actually endeavor to change or make the world a better place by being in it still.
Would he say we endeavor to perfect the world?
In the ultimate sense, yes, while realizing that you're not going to get to that ultimate end goal. You know, so that raises the question of why doesn't God just, you know, beam us up, teleport us out the moment that he saves us?
Right.
You know, well, the reason is there's still a role for us to do in working out our salvation for us, but also to influence and be something to others. And so to some degree, Wesley is extending what Luther started, even though they're in this, you know, how do you deal with the whole works and the aspect of the things that happen after salvation, this idea of what is sanctification.
He has often sounded very Wesleyan in that regard.
And it even ties back into, you know, without chasing it too far, it ties back into your ideas on eschatology. Because the predominant eschatology that exists among a lot of fundamentalists and evangelicals today is some form of premillennial eschatology, you know, where you stand on the tribulation part of that's the other adjective that goes in front of it. But this idea of the world is not going to progress to be any better. It's just going to get worse to the point that Christ has to come to set it all in order, versus an amillennial approach, which was more traditionally what existed through most of church history, is that over time the church can influence the world, not to the point that that everything is magically fixed, but that we progress more towards something that looks more like heaven here on earth through the church being engaged in what's going on earth. Those are two very different points of view about, you know, even the practicality of Christian ministry. You know, if you really hold to that premillennial, you know, especially the Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, you know, Left Behind, rapture, it's going to get bad. The church is going to get ripped out. It's going to get really bad. And then Christ is going to come, you know, and then impose the millennial rule, which is what that eschatology holds to. What you're basically being told there, yeah, you should be doing this stuff, but you should be doing this stuff so that people are in the position where they're going to be the ones that are pulled out, or that they're taken care of if they're not, if they die before that happens. But let's don't fool ourselves. It ain't going to get better. That very much is, to many degrees, a modern theological position of a lot of folks that are in the church. Historically, that's not been the case, and this ties more back to this: can we have an impact? Should we have an impact on society thing? So this even begins not only impact your day-to-day Christian walk, but what do you think about the, you know, how it's all going to play out in the end? Are we going to continue to have an impact to the point that the world gets better? It becomes more like being a form of the image of Christ, or is it just really just a pointless exercise?
Nope, he's going to say justification is the door to sanctification. And anyone who has the Spirit and who is being sanctified, Wesley will say, they have a goal or a teleos in front of them that is pulling them forward, and they will see victory in the course of their life. They will see a reduction and even an eradication of that narcissism that resides in the heart of us all. And in the end, whether in this life or the next, Wesley believes Christian perfection is always the goal.
More thoughts on that?
Well, it seems to me that, I guess to some degree that is part of our goal, is to be conformed to the image of Christ. But we can't do it in our own strength. I mean, it is a work of the Spirit. And then the other thing, I just know from my own life that there's times when I'm much more in the Word and being more aware of the presence of God and abiding in Him, where I do feel like there's less propensity for sinfulness, whereas on the other days or other times, it's the opposite. So I do think there's some validity to that.
The roller coaster ride of our sanctification, which is also I'm going to go ahead and start the Great Awakening because just to get us headed down that path. So let's see if it really.
Well, before we start that, and this may come out later, but when they talked about, I can't remember now the exact phrase, but perfecting our salvation. Methodists do not now believe in the sanctity of the believer, right? They do not believe in once saved, always.
The security of the believer. I think you would get different views inside of Methodism. I mean, one of the things that comes from the more extreme your Calvinistic view is on, or your Arminianistic view is on that. The perseverance of the saints comes from the pea and the tulip to a degree. I mean, it's the fact that continues on there. That's how we like to some degree, we like to mix and match those things. We like to pull I don't like being totally depraved, so I'm gonna pull that part out. I'll take the Arminian side on that. And I don't like that word limited atonement at all. So I'm going to take the Arminian side on that. But that because it's God's choice and God's election thing, that means it can't be undone. I like that. So I'm going to bring that into the equation.
Yeah.
And again, the thing about that, I mean, we covered it to some degree without going through every verse reference that exists, because there's literally hundreds of verse references in different places. The Bible speaks to both. There are verses that speak to both sides of this, which is why it became a debate. You know, it's I think you have to be very careful about looking at the context there to understand, not pulling those things out of context. But I mean, we talked about the Romans 8 passages are the trickiest ones in some way. What does it mean that God predestined or that He foreknew? What does election mean? Well, we've talked about this so many times. It's that aspect of, one of the ways I tend to want to explain it, because it works for me, is applying a different concept of time to God's perspective than my own. That's how God, it's not that God foreknew, it's just that God knows. It's because for Him, there is no before, after, post, during, it's all the eternal present. That's how I work it out in my head. Whether that's right or not, that helps me in my head, but I'm not even sure that's right. But I do know that God is not bound by time. So that's one way I think we can understand those verses, to say, yes, He foreknew in the way that we think of foreknowledge, but for Him, it's just knowledge. And does that mean He chose? Well, yes, He chose, but it's not like He chose before for later. It's choosing, for me, the other part of that, when I really think it through, is that the cross is eternally present for God, which is also another scary thing to think about, is that, that's not in the past. That's not, it is done. It is finished. Jesus said it is finished.
But Jesus was bound by time because of his humanity.
Right, at
So
that point.
that's the struggle again, is that I don't think we can understand it because we're bound by time too. So
And the
doesn't mean I don't think we shouldn't
right.
think about it and kind of try to understand this debate. But again, I don't think it's kind of the one discussion versus the 10 discussion, do I have to agree with you 100% on this? I don't think we have to 100% agree on this, because I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. He died on the cross for my sins, and I've accepted that. That's a most important. But what do I think about this? I don't think it's on the same level as that.
I would agree with that.
One of the things I was listening to this week was in reference to the Dr. Heiser, in reference to the elect. And he pointed out that Paul in Romans said the elect, just because you're elect doesn't mean that you're going to be saved. The reality is that you have to believe that Christ is the Son of God, and then Christ steps forward and says you have to not only believe, but you also need to follow my commandments. If you love me, follow my commandments. And so I think that's part of it. I think the problem we all face is it's a constant struggle, and Christ, I think, was very adamant about it. It's going to be a struggle, and you need to be struggling. You don't need to think that. Fall back and say, I made it. I no longer believe in the concept of once saved, always saved. I think with free will, I think you can denounce and go a different path, but struggle.
Well, even the way that's commonly dealt with by those who do believe in once saved, always saved, is they'll say, well, then you just never really had your salvation experience. That's the way you have to balance it. You aren't really saved.
Yeah.
It's not possible for you to lose it, which means that if you look like you've lost it, you never had it to begin with. That's the way that gets balanced out.
Yeah, but Paul always says that you have to struggle to the end. And I think you can't coast on the fact that I'm saved. I think that you have to produce fruits.
And I think that's where, again, back to this idea of the challenge that Wesley and Luther got in a room and they started talking about this. It was, okay, how does that work? What should that look like? Because if you're not careful, it's easy to slip down to, well, then there is the element of works that gets, because it's we look at works as being the evidence of salvation, not the thing that actually produces the salvation. But it's that's a fine line to really try to separate those things out, right? The book of James is the most normal book we would go to in the New Testament to point this out. Salvation without, basically what he says is salvation without works is dead, because you can't claim that you're alive and not show the things that show the evidence of life. And so, that's where those who would go to point that out. But then it's also very clear in other passages in scripture that Jesus said, I am the way that there's one mode of salvation. The mode of salvation is not Jesus plus, it's Jesus. And all of us have something that we normally want to put in the blank of the plus, the Jesus plus, fill in the blank. Almost all of us have something we want to put there, or some things we want to put there in the process.
But then but to add anything to Jesus means too that he says, don't add things to this, it's like God gave us the 10 commandments, but then how many laws did the Jews come up with? Over 600, kind of a thing. So if we start adding things to Jesus, then
But by the same token, last week I was rambling on and Kathy boiled it down to one thing, love. That's what Christ says, love your God with all your heart, all your mind. And the second commandment to this one is love your neighbor as yourself. That boils it down to two commandments, and those are both hard. There are times when your child is sick, you're upset, and you do foolish things, make foolish thoughts. And there are times when your neighbor is not necessarily your neighbor in the old classic sense of being friendly. So,
Well, in fact, it's in response to that Jesus tells the story of the good Samaritan. They say, okay, who's my neighbor? Well, let me really stand that on the head for you. You know, that group of people that you despise, them.
yeah,
That's your neighbor.
yeah.
And he adds that element to it. We won't start this here except the Great Awakening thing, except for me to make sure I just tie these things together. To me, I clearly see an evidence of God's providence in what's going on here with the timing, in the sense that this is coming along, meaning Wesley and the way that he's thinking about things, that what becomes the Methodist movement and projects that into the theological conversation. It finds in history, in the timeline of history, it finds itself in this period of the First Great Awakening, and in the unique aspect of what's not that there's not these awakenings do happen in England and Europe and in the old world. It's not that they are unique to the Americas, but there is something unique that is going on in the Americas because of many of those who had held different positions theologically have come here in a mode of finding refuge or being able to do that. And there's an independent, this is where this, what influences what? Does the Great Awakening influence the Revolution? Does the Revolution influence the Second Great Awakening? The answer is yes. It's not a 100% overlap between the two by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a back and forth influence that's happening between the two. And so there is something unique that's going on at this time, the early 1700s, in American colonial life, that has created a space for what will become these evangelical revivalist movements that will come to be known as the First Great Awakening. They will influence politics and society. Politics and society will turn back around and influence that. So there is this interplay, and I think there is something to be said for God raising up a Wesley and a Whitefield, and a generation earlier to some degree, although he does participate in the First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, in this backdrop of where that's allowed to happen, in much the same way that the backdrop for Luther and the first stage of the Reformation, there's a backdrop for that allows that to come to be, and so he steps into that. And so the dangerous place to go here, and we'll try to avoid going there, except that we have to go there to some degree, is understanding this over the next couple of weeks as we're talking through the progression of this theological thought. Now this starts getting mixed in with our American political national heritage. Mm-hmm. And it's good to recognize that those two things, and from my perspective, influence each other. You can't deny that they didn't influence each other. You also have to be very careful to not assume that one influenced the other more than it actually did, because they were separate things. The Great Awakening was not the American Revolution. The American Revolution was not either of the two Great Awakenings. Are they connected? Yes.
So is it called the Great Awakening because it was like an awakening of people's thinking about God?
It was, the term we would most appropriately use today is this idea of revival preaching, which was, it's not revolutionary to us at all. It was very revolutionary during that day. Because the other thing that it's going to do is it's actually going to do something that is ecumenical to a degree too, which is the other thing to recognize here, is that suddenly there is something of a breaking down of the traditional barriers between various theological positions, what we may think of today as being denominational positions, which existed here, Those get broken down to some degree.
Mhm.
Good thing. Those get broken down to some degree. Bad thing. Because one of the things we're going to see when we, particularly, I think he covered this well in the video on the First Great Awakening, he's giving this history, is that, okay, think about the open camp meeting and open air preaching and what goes on with that. Okay, somebody gets converted. Okay, now how's the discipleship going to work? What's going to be their connection to a local church? Well, that's not as thought out, right? So you have these great open air revivalist awakening types of meetings that are both at the same time bolstering the church and undermining the church simultaneously, particularly the traditional church, which is not necessarily just participatory in this.
Yeah, in many cases, the open air revival, the preaching was being done because those men doing the preaching were not sanctioned by the very churches in that community.
Correct.
So they couldn't preach in the church. They had to preach
Outside the church.
outside.
And so there's, it's easy to look at this and be, oh, it's a great, and it is, this is a true statement. It was a great sweeping revival movement. Yes. That's good. Yes. Because one thing she'll mention, we'll probably watch most of the First Great Awakening video, because I think it's important that we understand that period of history, because it's not just church history, but it's a great degree American church history for us to have that context. But Franklin makes the comment, he's going to reference it. It's like suddenly the whole world was finding religion. And the point being that Franklin would not be saying that if the world was already somewhat, that he was living in was already somewhat religious. That would not seem so odd to Franklin if that were the norm. But it had reached the point, when you think it through, that it had become not the norm. And this is where I think we have our American myths. And every myth is founded in, to some degree, and maybe even a great degree, in truth, right? We have this idea of, the Puritans / Pilgrims, they come and they're these very religious people, and they bring over these ideals, including religious freedom, and we are a quote unquote Christian nation, which is both true and wrong at the same time. Because, for example, the founding fathers, many of them, were Christian. Many of them were not what you would even necessarily recognize today as being in the same vein of Christianity that you are. The great example to me there is Jefferson.
Yeah.
Jefferson has his version of the Gospels.
Without miracles.
Yeah, which for him, it was important to tear out all the miracles.
Yeah.
And
the original Jesus seminar.
yeah, and but yet there is an American mythology out there to some degree. With Jefferson being grounded roughly in the founding fathers, and we're founded as a Christian nation. We're certainly founded on Christian concepts politically. There is no doubt about that. But they look to, for example, the organization of the Constitution looks to concepts that you will find in the way that, but in the Old Testament law and Mosaic practices. I mean, we borrowed tremendous things from a common understanding in Scripture, even in terms of how we organized ourselves politically.
There was common understanding in a monotheistic God, creation God, and I think Jefferson would say omnipotent and omniscient.
It was probably a deist.
Yeah.
We generally call a deist, and we'll use that term a lot. So maybe it's worthwhile for me to define it here. That's deism believes in God. The most extreme sort of form of deism is, yes, there is a God, but he's not actively engaged in the day-to-day activities of man, which Wesley would say, no, he's very much actively. That's the whole point of the sanctification and the Christian perfection. He's very involved in the day-to-day activities of man. But certainly many of, again, they were a diverse group. They weren't, we want to lump them as like one cookie cutter. They were all cut from her. They were not that by any stretch of the imagination. They had different theological positions, they had different political positions, they had different philosophical positions that overlap to a great degree, but were all unique and distinct as well. But this, we have this myth that's again based in some element of reality of America was founded as a Christian nation. The founding fathers were Christians. Most of them were believers in God. There's no doubt about that. And you see that reference, Declaration of Independence. We believe that all men are endowed by their Creator. Notice that what he did not say there was he didn't say all men are endowed by Jehovah God. He didn't go there. He said their Creator. It was vague to a degree. And as a result of that, we need to be careful about how we read back into that, because we have a tendency to want to read back into it in a way I think that can be a little bit dangerous.
Yeah, but the other side is because they were living pretty much in a monolithic society of belief, and even though obviously Jefferson wasn't a good Baptist, the background was of the Christian God, the Old Testament and New Testament Christian God. So when he said Creator,
He
the
meant,
implication was
yes.
God was
yeah, and the people that read him easily
even
interpreted
more
that.
importantly understood that.
Right. That was not, that was not a lost or foreign concept to it.
Whereas if
And
we look at it from the 21st century perspective, it's a much different, a much more confused understanding.
And one of the things that we talked about there was we sort of talked about it. We skipped over it because we'll come back to it. This is also the age of the Enlightenment.
Yes.
So this is the age of when there's a whole movement that's going on that is about not theism, not belief in God, but in the concept of what man is able to, what man is able to know. And we get that as well going on in the other side, the age of reason. It's not the age of theism, it's the age of reason. And so that's the backdrop to this as well. Again, Franklin being a good example of this. Franklin is one of the, he's one of the founding. If we're going to make our top 10 list of founding fathers, Franklin's going to make anybody's list of the top 10. Franklin was at best a theist, probably was much more leaning towards being an atheist. I mean, it's hard to know exactly where he's at because he's also pragmatic enough that he's going to say things that make it tough to pin that down.
Yeah, he was politically correct enough.
Yeah,
he understood saying the right thing.
But he certainly was. For example, when we found, again, without making this too political, when we founded our nation, we did not found it to have a national religion.
Right.
And that was a very intentional choice. And so again, when we want to, the American myth of we're a Christian nation, yes, we were a nation primarily of Christians. That's a fair thing to say. But the establishment of the nation was not as a Christian nation. In fact, it was intentionally not that to a degree. Then when there's concern about that it may slip into that, well, we'll make sure that's taken care of very quickly in this set of amendments we're going to pass called the Bill of Rights. That's going to be number one. We're going to make sure that there's no doubt that there's not going to be the establishment of religion. I think
at the same time, though, most of the men who voted for the First Amendment were from states that had an established church.
Which is about to say, I think he mentions this in the video here, was the idea that Massachusetts, for example, still had a state and did for some number of years beyond that.
Yeah.
And so we are and we aren't all at the same time. That's where this gets a little bit complicated. But the timing is that, the America we think of today politically owes a lot to what was going on with Wesley and Whitefield and those folks, and the timing of that, because this is as we're leading up towards the revolution, and the argument can be made, part of the rationale behind why we don't need to have the same, while we can be quote unquote independent, is that we can be independent also from authoritarian control inside of a church. We don't need bishops and cardinals and others to tell us what to do, particularly from our Protestant bend of not needing that. And he'll make the point in the first and second Great Awakening videos when we watch them of the ones that the denominations and the political and the philosophical, theological thought that spread, the less hierarchical, the better it spread. The very act, fewer bishops, no, okay, yeah, the Methodist Church had bishops, but they weren't like Catholic bishops.
Right.
They were very different. So we'll pick up with that again, not because we need the politics of it. We understand how the politics and the theology influence each other, and particularly how we got to where we are. fundamentalism, as we know it as a modern concept, is launched during this era as well. So we have to think about what that means, because that's going to be a very important concept that we got to think about. Thoughts, comments, questions? I do have to shut us down. We're 20 minutes into the run.
Okay. Are Bill and Sherry still on?
They're
Yeah,
with
any
us.
thoughts from our satellite?
Yeah, we
I was gonna say,
And they can see
Bill,
you
are you
got.
there?
And when
Yeah, we're here.
I stopped the sharing. I'm about to stop the, if I can find it, I'm about to stop the recording if I can find the magic.